Okay, here's an overview of Updoc in Stemmons. This is our enterprise content management or document management system, and it's built on top of our entities program. So we're using entities as essentially the back end. So here's how it works: just think about an organization, and maybe we have a bunch of invoices. We'll use invoices and contracts as examples. So if we think about these things, historically we would have imagined them as being in a file cabinet or in a location somewhere, but when we're in the world of metadata-driven enterprise content management, then we're not thinking about location, we're thinking about what is the profile of this document. So for example, with invoices, we would we'd always have a name or title of the document, but we would want to know who's the vendor, what's the status, what's the due date, maybe what's the amount, the invoice number, and so forth. With contracts, we have a different set of metadata. We still would want the name of the contract, but we might want to know who's the company that we're contracting with, what type of contract is it, termination date, and so forth. So really anything that we want to understand about these pieces of content, we would set up as metadata. And of course, we do that in entities. So there would be an entity type called contracts and another entity type called invoices. And what we would do for these in configuration is we would check the box that says use for Updoc. And what that does is it tells the entity system, hey, there's not just one way we're going to look at this, there's multiple ways. So as we set up these entity types in entities, we have our traditional interface where we would be able to go into the entity's application and just kind of, say, hey, show me this entity. For example, let's say we're talking about this contract over here. We'll call it contract D. So we would look at contract D, and we would have the information. There's some kind of buttons across the top, and here's the metadata that we have to describe it. Then we also have the ability to kind of upload a document. So there'd be in the notes section kind of an attachment, and it would say the name of the Word document or whatever. And that actually is the piece of content that we're looking at here. So if we look at something that has the Updoc check mark, we can still look at it through the traditional method. But that's not really great for enterprise content management, so we have a separate interface. And the Updoc interface looks kind of different. It's a PC-based application, and it says Updoc on the top, and on the side it has some information about the different types of things. There's kind of a traditional folder-like tree view that you can use to kind of look at things, and there's some options here about adding things and searching and so forth. But basically what happens is you get a list of documents, okay, which is really a list of entities. And then you have a pane where you can do a preview, or you can look at the notes, or whatever. And really all this is doing is it's a fairly thin application that's like a front end for entities. So entities is powering Updoc, and that's why if you look carefully, or if you have it configured this way, when you put a piece of content into Updoc, you can see it through the traditional interface or through the Updoc interface, which is a separate application. Now, there's a couple of interesting things that happen here as well. So this contract that we're looking at may have new versions that come up. So even though it's one kind of piece of content, we might have several versions where we've kind of gone from one to the other and made changes and saved up a new version and so forth. When you look in the traditional version of entities, you're going to see additional files dropped in. And the most recent one shows up in Updoc as the most recent version. And then, of course, you can, through the Updoc interface, there's a section here where you can look at versions, and you can roll back and see, hey, what did an earlier version look like? So you can revert to earlier versions of something. They're all stored in entities. The other thing is, because the actual document is an entity, whether you're in the traditional interface or you're in the Updoc interface, there's some things that you can do. We have permissions. If you set your permissions so that a certain person or certain role can't look at this entity type, then they're not going to be able to look at those Updocs either. We also have the ability to add notes to it, and the notes can show up in both of these areas. As mentioned, we can attach different versions of things. There's also blockchain for validation if you have that enabled. And finally, we can look at the activity log. So this gives us a history of everything that has happened to that document. In the same way that we can use entities to power other things that we're doing using Stemmons, we can have those things apply to documents as well. So for example, we may want to use cast to schedule something to happen regularly, or we may want to configure a trigger to do something associated with that document, or we might want to use Quest to do some quality assurance and review things and kind of have a checklist for everything that has to happen with that document. There's a lot of things that are available now because this is not a separate system, it's part of Stemmons. We can use all these other things that we do in Stemmons on a regular basis. So that's Updoc. When you look at the application itself, you might tend to see this as a standalone application because it is something separate that you launch and is installed on your machine. But really, it's very deeply and intimately tied to the whole entity's infrastructure and therefore the rest of all the great things we can do using Stemmons Central.